anyway, yeah, let's do a phase test. That should be fun. I don't know if you're going to hear a difference, but we'll see. I don't know. A little before I do that, are you looking at the envelope on a scope or anything? Because there it's going to be very obvious. Are you looking at me on a scope?
No, the scope's hooked up to the R390, and I'm running the ITT with this rig, so it'll just have to be by ear, but maybe it'll be distinct enough.
Okay, we'll try. Well, this is the normal phase. And you know what? Before I even switch the phase, let me bring up the modulation monitor on. I have a different computer that I use for that. I just want to bring that thing up here. There's my timer going off. I got to shut off the sprinkler. Okay, I got the modulation monitor up. Before I switch the phase, let me go out and turn off my sprinkler, Paul. Don't go away. This is WB2CAU.
Okay, that's fine. I'll just hang out here and see if anybody else is loitering in the wings, but we'll be standing by. WB2CAU, WA3VJB.
Interruption. If I didn't have my timer going, I'd be forgetting about the sprinkler, and that thing would be on way too long. I didn't want to. That's why I have the timer going here. Of course, it's handy that I have it to remind me that the sprinkler was on. Anyway, are you still there, Paul?
Yeah, we're ready to go. Ready to go.
Okay, all right. This is the normal phase, and I'm looking at myself on the modulation monitor now, and of course I'm going to see it when I switch. And this is the reverse phase. This is a reverse phase. And I can see the difference in the waveform, particularly on the lower frequencies, when I speak, and it's obvious that this is the wrong phase. But I do have more. I do have as much positive peaks as I did in the correct phase. Let me switch back to the correct phase. All right, this is the correct phase. And the reason why I still have the positive peaks, I think, is because I'm running this thing with reduced carrier a little bit, and that might be doing it. I don't know. Did you notice anything different? By the way, I'm using the microphone that you do not prefer, the Mackie. What is this again? EM89D. I couldn't remember I remember the 89D, but I couldn't remember the first letters. It's EM89D. I might switch over to the Sennheiser in a bit because I know you prefer that mic. But anyway, this is the Mackie. So what did you hear when I switched phase? Did I sound god awful? WA3VJB, WB2CAU.
No, you didn't. It's one of those subtleties that unless you were drawing my attention to it, I probably wouldn't have noticed. The low-end response is not as clean. The high-end response drops by about 200 hertz according to the waveform on one of the SDRs on which you're about 20/9. I did not hear any attenuation here in the room of your high-end response, but I noticed that the passband you were delivering dropped by about 200 hertz on out of phase, and I could hear in the room a definite sort of grunge in your lower register. Go ahead.
Well, that shows the importance of being in the proper phase, because it appears that everything is right in the proper phase. But I haven't noticed any difference in tonal quality, really. But then again, I'm not at the receiving end, so yeah. Anyway, I'm glad that I am in the correct phase here. I could do something else here. I could let's see, try something else. I'll see if I can change my carrier level to 100%, which means I'm not going to have any reduced carrier. Change this to 100. Apply. Okay, there we go. Now we'll try this. This is with 100%. Well, why do I have 0.2 in here? I did a typo. Let's change that to 0. All right, there we go. Apply. Okay, all right. Anyway, this is no reduced carrier. This is everything. This is normal AM, full carrier AM. And now I'll change the phase. Let's see what happens. Okay, now they're same thing. I still, I don't know. It must be an anomaly with this exciter. That even in the wrong phase, or maybe it's my voice, even in the wrong phase I have more positive peaks than negative peaks. And I'll switch back to normal phase. That's the normal phase with that little box that I built recently. And there we go. Do you notice anything different? You probably, you know, I think you're kind of an audio purist, so you probably like the quality of the audio now compared to before with the full carrier.
This receiver doesn't seem to be as sensitive to it as the R390 and its younger sister, the R390A. However, if the rapid fade that I'm detecting gets much worse, I bet you I would start to notice that the asymmetrical version of your signal is not as easy to copy. Not that there'd be hardship, but just is not as clear because of the selective fade distortion. There's about it's a little more than 5 dB, close to 10 dB swing in your carrier right now, about 3 cycles per second. It's up and down the roller coaster. I don't know if you're seeing that on myself or not. Same characteristics in phase and out of phase. The lower end got a little grungier and you lost a little bit off the highs. The grunge I could hear in the room, the highs I could see on the SDR. And I'm using, I think, manual gain control on the SDR, which helps negate the effect of the receiver gain adjustment, just to be even more definitive. So yeah, in phase is a good thing, and although it's subtle, all that stuff adds up, Eric, as you know. WB2CAU, WA3VJB.
Yep, in our goal to sound as best as we can. WA3VJB, this is WB2CAU. I'm going to switch over to the Sennheiser, but I have to pull it out of the drawer here, so just stand by a minute.
Well, you'll get a kick out of this. This is the RE27 that I usually use because it's a convenient mic off the RCA. But I can mix it down to the Sennheiser and see if you notice any difference with the Sennheiser. This is the 421. What's this? It's 2 clicks off M. Let me put it on M. This is the music setting on the 421. Probably sounds a little tubby, so that's probably why I had it. 1 click, 2 clicks towards speech. Not quite dead center, but it's 1 click to the music side of speech. And then I'll go back to the RE27. Oh, a little bit hot there, sorry. The processor probably caught the audio amplitude variance. And the 27, I don't know, looks better on the scope to me. They're both in phase. So there's something about what the Optimon is doing that it seems to distinguish one mic from the little one passes. There we go. And now back on the 421 again, which does not seem to have as much positive peaks. Yeah, that's 1 click off of the speech setting now. I guess I was in the middle. This is 1 click off of S, and then I can narrow it up even more, and it probably sounds a little thin at this point, especially compared to the RE27 that I'm now back on. So this is the 27 that seems to have better positive peaks. This is a separate issue. It probably has to do with the audio processor more than anything. So the 27 sounds like this. Its settings are all flat. I don't have any roll off or high. Do they exaggerate or do they roll it off? I don't know which. It's all flat anyway. It doesn't matter. And then one more little écoute on the Sennheiser 421 on speech, and then I can, do this. You're probably about to do the same thing. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can't switch as quickly as you do, Paul. I have to actually disconnect the microphone and unplug one and plug the other one in its place. This is the Sennheiser. Same EQ settings that I use on the Mackie. I didn't find that there was a necessity to change the EQ with this microphone about a year and a half ago, I guess. And then when I got the Mackie, I tried it with the same. I like the EQ settings that I had for the Sennheiser on the Mackie, so I just left it. So I actually have the same EQ settings for both microphones. But anyway, this is the Sennheiser, and I think when you heard me do this test once before, I think with was it Dirk? I don't know, somebody. You tended to like the Sennheiser better, and others seem to like the Mackie better. So it's very subjective. Now the difference between your two microphones is so subtle. If you didn't tell me that you were switching, I probably wouldn't have realized it. But when I'm aware of it, I do like the RE27 better, and maybe it's psychological. Part of it is psychological too, because I consider the RE27 to be sort of like my reference standard. I actually bought an RE27, a used RE27, about 2 years ago, and it was only like about $30 less than the new price. So I mean, wasn't like I was buying something really cheap. It turned out to be defective, and right off the get-go, I said, this thing doesn't have any low-end response. So a friend of mine who has an RE27, I said, here, plug in my RE27 and against your RE27. I want to listen to you over the air and see if I can hear a difference. I think I sent you recordings of that particular person, but not that particular test. But anyway, we did that test, and his RE27 sounded correct, and my RE27 sounded like it had a lack of a low end, a severe lack of low end. We're not talking about something subtle that only a purist would notice. I'm talking about something drastic. So anyway, I sent it back to the guy. I had bought it on eBay, and I sent it back to the guy, and he wasn't crediting me for it right away, and it ran up to, I think you only have about 30 days with eBay, and I think it was like the 28th or the 29th day. He wasn't doing anything, so I contacted eBay, and eBay did something, and then I gave him bad feedback, and that was that, and he wasn't happy about that. But if he had acted more quickly, and I don't usually give bad feedback. I think it was probably the second time in 25 years that I've had an eBay account that I gave someone bad feedback. But if he had reacted to my request for a credit quickly, he wouldn't have gotten that. But anyway, it was a defective RE27. That was the story of my RE27. I never bought another one after that. I just figured, well, I could take that money and just buy other microphones and see how close I could get to the RE27. But I consider the RE27 to be my personal reference standard. I like the RE27. There you go. A lot of talk about microphones. WA3VJB, WB2CAU on the Sennheiser.
Yeah, it's a good mic. I don't know. I've become very generous in my thinking about the condenser mics. Although I think your Mackie is a dynamic. If I don't have my notes in front of me from the last time we talked, but Mackie and Audio-Technica and Behringer and Peavey all make what have become known as a category as large diaphragm condenser microphones. And depending on how quiet the room is that somebody is in, they can work very well. On a quick break, though, is your Mackie a dynamic, do I remember?
Yes, it is. All the microphones I've been using here recently have been dynamics. I have a Behringer B1, which I consider an excellent microphone, but unfortunately it requires a 48-volt supply, and I don't have that in line right now. So if I did, then I would also switch between that. And the problem with the condenser microphone, to me, is it picks up a lot, and it's going to pick up my air conditioner and my blower more than I really want. And particularly in the summertime with the air conditioner going, it's probably not a good choice of microphones. But I happen to like the large diaphragm condenser mics myself.
Yeah, the B1 is the one I think I first encountered as being a good sounding microphone on a station I otherwise was familiar with. It's like, well, that'll do. And they're not a lot of money. I mean, you can spend $300 on an RE27 used, or buy a new one for $4 1/4, whatever the street price is, or you can get a condenser mic. And if the room is set up properly, it's the same thing. There really isn't that much of a distinction to justify the extra money, and you can go buy yourself a good shock mount or something, or one of those ladies' hosiery wind popping screens, if that's your problem, because some people say they pop their keys more on a condenser mic, and that might be a function of how the wind screens are constructed. Oh, speaking of construction, I have a hunch that your RE27 was either dropped or had been smoked in. I've seen some writings about the RE20, the older version of the 27 that came out about 50 years ago now, that the foam can fail. It's an isolation function that the foam provides, and when it fails, it's friable. The little pieces get on the mylar diaphragm of the microphone and can cause a physical sound as they rattle. And then apparently there's enough physical constriction from these little particles that it affects the low-end response. The excursions of the diaphragm are not as great when it's carrying all this, foam particle stuff. So I have not heard that problem with the RE27. So it may just have been dropped or something, and maybe that's why the guy was selling it, because he knew he had a boner on his hands. Or maybe the little roll-off switches had a problem. I think there's a little circuit board in there that does probably by RC attenuation, the roll-off functions that those switches provide. I don't know how they do it in the RE20. I've never opened up either one of them, although I've had both. But you were wise to compare it against another example of the 27 to make sure it wasn't something in your system, and then declare that specific example a defective product. Well, here's a fairly dramatic demonstration. Let me give you, I'll just switch over to it, and then I'll identify what it is. This is a kind of a standard of the industry. You'll see them at very, very many news conferences on the stand, and it's been out for many years. And it has its own kind of tonal quality that you can imagine for broadcast news gathering is ideal at a podium somewhere where somebody's addressing the microphone and making some remarks or other. I've had one of these in my reporter's kit for, since I was in college. And we're talking about a reference microphone. This is the one I always had folded up next to the tape deck when I was out in the field. It's a rugged soldier, and it has the marks to show it. So it probably also sounds like crap compared to the 7 because it doesn't have any warmth at all. But it's got a windscreen on it that I have used to do a report while on a bicycle. It's not a foam windscreen. It's actually a mesh metal windscreen and a shock mount around an inside capsule. So not only is there no rattling noise, there also isn't any wind noise. And I was pedaling along at probably 12 to 15 miles per hour, and people at the time, and we're talking 40 years ago, said, how did you do that? You obviously were on the bike because we could hear your gear change. It's a 10-speed. And I said, well, that's the RE50 for you, and that's explained. So now we'll go back over to the RE27, and your office wants to come back. WB2CAU, WA3BJB. How about that?
Interesting. It doesn't sound bad, but it sounds like you're inside of a box, or the microphone is inside of a box. It kind of adds like a hollow sound to it, which when you're on the RE27, that isn't there at all. So have you gotten that kind of a subjective report?
No, not from that kind of an imagery. I wonder if it's the frequency response that makes it sound like a box. Where if I were to cup my hands around my mouth, it gives you the same effect, and it sounds like you're physically constraining yourself.
Yeah, it's that kind of a sound. Yeah. No, it's a good microphone. What did you say? That was an RE50?
RE50. It really is the one that you see everywhere. It's a cool microphone. It was an upgrade from what I call the lowly 635A that you've probably also seen around, that did not have a windscreen, did not have any shock mount facility, but you could pound nails with it. And there actually was a late 1960s advertisement in the broadcast trades from Electro Voice of someone pounding nails, and it's like, yes.
I have to remove all of the contents of the filing cabinet and I decided to build a dolly, so in the future I can move the filing cabinet more easily out of the way if I have to when it's full of files. So I built this dolly, and I finished it yesterday. So today's project was going to be to take all those files out, and I put them. And I had to buy some of these crate files thing at Staples, where you can, put your files in a temporary holder, the hanging files, and empty out this cabinet, put it on the dolly that I made, and move it out of the way, and get to changing that outlet. So that was going to be my project for today. But since I am retired like you, I've been retired longer than you have, tomorrow is another day. So if I get on the radio today and don't finish my project today, there's always tomorrow, provided I live long enough. WA3VJB, WB2CAU.
That was a nice little stinger there at the end, Eric, if I live long enough. Yeah, I don't know if your filing cabinet shelves, each individual drawer is on a roller rail like mine, but they come out independently. I had to move the one that's out in the garage. It used to be here in the radio lodge, and I needed some room for a rack or something. And each of those slide outs is on a track that you can lift the front edge and just pull the whole cabinet out, that particular shelf. And I think it's a 4-shelf filing cabinet. And you can just move the cabinet. Maybe yours is all integral and you can't do that if you're buying those portable hanging boxes and things. Yeah, very good on the electrical boxes. Well, that's the cheapest $1.50 protection you're ever going to find, is just to replace those sockets, especially a high-use socket, wall socket. Pam's got one in the master bathroom that she plugs and unplugs her hairdryer on every single day. And not only is it a physical wear and tear, but it's a high current situation with that 1500-watt appliance. So I took a look at it when we recently repainted and did some remodeling in that bathroom, and yeah, it had a lot of wear in it. The prong receptacles had a lot of scrape, and I don't think they were as tight as they used to be from, the prongs over the years. And I had wired that one myself, probably 25 years ago, and agree with the idea of the little push hole versus the screw downs. So, I just went to the electrical supply shop and got another couple of outlets for that one and another one. You can buy 20 amp rated ones that have an extra offset prong on the hot side, that if you have a matching plug of a device that it expects to take 20 amps, it'll go in that socket, but not a conventional 15 amp household socket. So I knew that we'd put number 12 solid on that particular outlet, because we did the bathroom in a high current electrical wiring, because I envisioned putting one of those thermal light bulbs in the ceiling fan, for the winter months where you heat up the floor and the towel as you're drying off when you step out of the shower. So we upgraded the wiring on that. I knew it was 20 amp service, and I still had to consider whether I could get one in the right color or not, and this is the aesthetic part of it. I'm fine with brown bacon if I can get the 20 amp outlet, but I was overruled. No, we can't have that. It makes it look like a garage. So I think I succumbed and instead bought a 20 amp rated ground fault interrupter outlet of the Decora design, the square ones. Instead of the two round holes, it's got a square, actually a rectangular dual port thing that you got to get a new faceplate for. Now that looks modern. She likes that one. And of course, with the hairdryer being there and all, it probably was a safety improvement anyway in case it gets dropped in the sink. But be that as it may, I understand completely your rewiring. Now, your house was built in '79. That was after the aluminum wiring controversy. My brother had a house that he since has sold that was built in the late 60s, I think, when copper prices were crazy. WA3VJB, by the way, at 10 past. And he had to get some special spliced-in Romex that would take what was left of the aluminum wiring up in the wall and bound itself to a copper pigtail that would go to his sockets, because the aluminum wiring over a series of heatings and coolings from simple use, you know, the current. This stuff became brittle. And there were all kinds of, I don't know, class action suits or maybe just litigation about house fires caused by aluminum house wiring. So he fixed all the pigtails in the house and then sold the place and got the hell out of there and is in a place that's got all copper wiring. But that was a separate thing. And 1979 rang a bell as that being a crossover period. I'm sure you would have commented if you had aluminum wiring. But I think they were done with it by then because they knew the problems it was having. I had a main circuit breaker box, Eric, from Federal Pacific. And if you were to look them up, you'd see class action lawsuits because the breakers that they used as they sat in the distribution bar, and that's another receptacle and prong construction, there was a lot of I2R losses from the design, a lot of heat resistance there. And those boxes would catch fire under heavy load after a period of years. And apparently the problem got worse, much like it did with the wires stuck in the holes of the duplex outlet, where heating and contraction wiggled the prong of the circuit breaker loose from the receptacle that it sat in the main breaker box. And of course, you know, nobody looks at the main breaker box downstairs to see if it's heating up or anything. So I took a look at it, and I said, wow, this is the same box. And when we did some remodeling, I got a whole brand new, you know, square D 200 amp household breaker load center in there now. And occasionally I'll put the handheld IR sensor on it to make sure nothing's warming up, because that's been 20 years too. No problems, you know. You just never know about some of this stuff. Go ahead.
Well, no, there's no aluminum wiring in this house at all. It's WB2CAU for ID. No aluminum wiring. It's all copper. When I was having the house built, an afterthought after the contract was drawn up, I asked the builder, the general contractor, I said, could you do me a favor? I said, I'll pay the extra charge. I said, can I have all of the outlets wired with 12 gauge wire, because I didn't want the IR drop. You know, even the 15 amp circuits, I know that, you know, 12 gauge is required for 20 amp circuits, but I wanted even the 15 amp circuits to be 12 gauge wire, not for the extra current necessarily, or, you know, to be able to put a bigger circuit breaker in the box, which I guess you're not supposed to do if you're, you know, well, the way the code is written, I think certain outlets have to be 15 amp outlets and nothing more, but there's, I guess, provisions where you can have a 20 amp circuit in kitchens and bathrooms and other rooms for for the high current entertainment devices and so forth. But I think generally speaking, they're supposed to be 15 amp circuits. Anyway, I guess for protection, so that if you go over 15 amps, it's going to pop the breaker. But anyway, so I asked for 12 gauge wire. So the builder said, yeah, I can do that. I can speak to my electrician. Now, as this house was being built, it was built while I was going to work and everything, and my wife and I at the time would come by here on a daily basis and, you know, check the progress of the house. It took a long time. The construction began on May 1st, 1979, and we moved in the middle of December of 1979. So it took a long time before the house was complete. Actually, it was completed in October, but we had some other things to clear up with the builder. But anyway, after the electrical contractor had been here, I went and I checked, and guess what? There was 14 gauge wire going to all the outlets. Like, you know, like I never had said anything to the builder. So I went back to the builder and I said to him, I said, do you recall that I asked about having 12 gauge wire to all of the outlets? And he says, yes. He says, and I spoke to my electrician, and he said that it's not permitted. It has to be 14 gauge wire. So I said to the builder, I said, well, 12 gauge wire is heavier wire. It should be allowed because it's heavier gauge and it's less voltage drop, and it's actually better than 14 gauge. So he turns to me, he says, are you an electrician? And I said, no, I'm not. He says, well, I'll take the word of my electrician over you. And that was the end of that.
Oh, man. Well, I hope he didn't charge you for the extra 12 gauge that you never got. Well, our electrician was actually a neighbor at the time.
it's a 20 amp outlet, so it has the you know, the pin can go vertical or horizontal on the you know the difference between the NEMA wiring between the 15 amp and the 20 amp plug. They're compatible for 15 amp, but they'll take a 20 amp plug also. Anyway, so I put a heavy duty outlet in there, and it made all the difference in the world. So it is favorable to use a heavy duty outlet on heavily used circuits. And so far, you know, I haven't seen any signs of wear on that outlet at all. But there are very cheap outlets out there. But the cheap outlets are okay if you have them wired around the screw, and like in my case here with this filing cabinet blocking the outlet, there are things plugged in there that were plugged in 40 years ago that are not unplugged and plugged in very often. So it probably have had plugs plugged into it maybe 5 or 6 times in its lifetime, which is okay. But anyway, let's see. Once I pull the file cabinet out of the way and I get in there, I can see what the story is. I may replace the outlet, or I may just rewire it. It all depends. I found, though, that in some cases the utility boxes are a little small, and the better outlet won't fit in there, and I have to reuse the original. You have to reuse the original outlet. But it really depends. In some rooms that I've been doing this, and I've been doing this progressively over the last couple of years, in some rooms, and I'm not near completion, by the way, in some rooms the box is big enough where it'll accommodate the slightly larger outlet. And by the way, the differences, we're talking about fractions of an inch, but it's enough where this outlet will fit in here and this one won't. So sometimes I have to use the original outlet depending on the box. And speaking of of circuit breaker panels, I have an FPE circuit breaker panel.
Oh my, WA3VJB.
And this is WB2CAU.
Yeah, that's not good. If you don't have an IR thermometer, I would buy one and see if you got any hot spots when you're using it. Dates back to, let's see, this place was built in 76, and the garage was built in 77. That's right, that's how I remember it. So yeah, Federal Pacific was still in business, but yeah, do an internet search, see if that box was one of the ones that was deemed a fire hazard, Eric. No fooling. Yeah, I wonder if your wall work boxes are metal or plastic. If they're plastic, of course, you can get away with a little bit of a friction fit. Metal, obviously, you're not going to. And I don't know how, unless you cut your drywall, you would ever replace that with a larger box. You're kind of stuck. Well, one more house wiring story here in the Radio Lodge, since this was kind of a custom-built place, stick-built from the ground up. I apparently could get away with a lot of stuff that the code for a residential setting could not approve. And I had my electrician, who was the neighbor, put in I guess this is a 50 amp service out here that comes off a dual 50 amp breaker in the house. The main load center has a 240 breaker, and it feeds 240 out to here. And I had him wire from the outer room of the Radio Lodge to in here in the studio, number 10 gauge, 25 amp breaker, 120 volts, ending in a pigtail that comes out of the wall with a strain relief. And the pigtail has a 25 amp commercial grade receptacle on it that fit in the back of the T368 because it did not have 240. And running that thing off of a 25 amp service with number 10 saw no voltage drop at all. Now that was the way to do it.
So you're saying you have 120 amp, 120 volt circuit running with 10 gauge wire?
Yeah, and it comes out of the wall with a strain relief, one of those screw-down strain reliefs like you'd put on a metal box, conduit box. And I've got about a 2-foot piece of wire that terminates in this commercial-grade receptacle that happens to match identically the back panel connector, which is prongs, on the T368.
The T368 does not run off to 40?
Nope. The original basic model had a dual primary, but the B, C, E, and F models did not.
What do you run today? I don't think you told me what your transformer is.
Now, this is the Super Senior.
Oh, okay. And you don't have any trouble with that? Because I understand that you're very, very sensitive to things, modulation peaks that might go over or just let you organize a bit.
Wow, this has been wonderful. That was part of my discussion about the antennas and the wire tuners, is that the Super Senior did have that sensitivity to even tarnish, which is the only problem I could actually find, so that's what I'm blaming it on the Merch 2000 wire tuner. Just enough tarnish that the protection circuitry would say, I ain't going into that, and it would trip. So that's when I built a proper 50-ohm coax-fed inverted V with the right angle in the center and the right length for resonance, and it's been fine ever since.
Oh, okay, so you're, okay, all right, very good. So is that what you're using now?
Yep, that's what I've been using for, quite a few months now. I had the 300G on a week and a half ago, and it's working okay. I can't use the Optimod, though. My old girl just doesn't like that density of modulation, and it gets kind of gnarly. So I had the other audio chain, which is a Pacific Recorders and Engineering set, on there, and it's just not as loud as this one. I don't have to have it this loud, but you get kind of addicted to it when you hear a recording, and it's like, yeah.
No complaints about the audio quality in the Super Senior. It's just the activity to things that I'm not necessarily paying close attention to all the time, and I tend to go offline very easily, and I haven't heard that from yours. Now, what other transmitters are you running there? You have that broadcast transmitter. You mentioned a number there. Now, I'm not familiar with most broadcast transmitters, because I never really worked in the industry outside of working at a radio station for about a month back in 1967. But that doesn't really count, because I was helping a friend of mine who was an engineer for the station, and we were doing ground screen maintenance, and I was the laborer who was scraping away dirt from the ground screen so that he could clean it up and attach fresh wires back to the tower base. So that's my only experience in working in a radio station. So I was a part-timer there. So anyway, so I have no experience with knowing these model numbers. So you have a broadcast transmitter there, and I think you mentioned a model number, but it doesn't mean anything to me because I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, no, I've had the 300G for about 20 years now. The 300G was made in from about 1946 to 1951. They made about 150 examples of it to respond to the post-war boom in AM broadcast stations. And it's a 1/4 kilowatt, pair of 810s modulating a pair of 810s. And they easily come up to 160. This one's been reworked considerably to be a tri-bander for 160, 80, and 40 meters. And I had a coil failure, loading coil failure, zorched over to the cabinet. And it was a hand-wound coil from the craftsmanship of Jim W8MAQ, who did the design work. And I could not find a coil that would match it to get me down to 160. So I gave up on 160, and now it's a dual bander, 80 and 40, which is fine. I wasn't on 160 anyway, not for many years. And it's a pretty transmitter. If you were to look up 300 Golf, you'll see that it's got the 810s left to right. They're behind an observation glass, which in turn is surrounded by chrome. And it's got 8 square-cut Bakelite meters that dance along as you make a transmission. And it's, you know, it's a cool rig. It's a neat rig. And it's been my main rig to the point that I got rid of the T368. That was the one I used for many years. It, too, I had about 15, almost 20 years. And that went to John, W3JN, for his place out at Deep Creek Lake. He has a cottage out there. And I managed to work my own transmitter just once. You know, that was kind of weird. It's like, hey, I know that transmitter. So that one's gone. And in its place against the wall where that little pigtail comes out with 20 amp service, 25 amp service, is my original homebrew transmitter that I think you and I may have first worked on. I got it in 1976, and Kevin, WB2CAU, helped me finish it. Some guy back in 1953, as best as we could tell, started building it out of a West Coast handbook design and never finished it because he turned slop bucket and then, you know, passed away in the mid-1970s. So his buddies were squaring away his estate, and this thing was posted on an index card in one of the local ham radio stores near me in Laurel, Maryland. And I saw it, and I said, whoa, you know? And they thought maybe somebody was going to make a linear amplifier out of it. And I said, no. So with Kevin's help, finished the point-to-point wiring and came to understand the design of the thing. And that's an 80 through 10 meter coil substitution type of band switching transmitter. And then the Super Senior rounds out the main 3 with the 32V2, which was my original novice transmitter, being an auxiliary transmitter as needed. So that's the roundup. WB2CAU, WA3VJB.
Right at 10:30, WA3VJB, WB2CAU. Okay, so let's see, what was I going to... So you have the 32V2, you have the 3300G, you have the homebrew transmitter, and you have the Super Senior. Now, I think you told me earlier what you were using for receiver, but I forgot what you said and I didn't write it down. What are you using for local receiver right now?
That's something my brother got me. It's an ITT McKay, MACKAY, commercial shipping receiver. And it came out of Newport News, Virginia, where they do a lot of commercial ship repair and refitting. Dates to 1981, says the date code on the thing. The model is kind of obscure. I haven't even found another one on the internet. 3040 Alpha. And it's solid state. It's got thumb wheel switches for frequency selection, a lot like the old Heathkit 2-meter rigs had. And it's, I think it does long wave. Yeah, it'll do long wave through 30 megs. A nice receiver, nice generous passband, probably 10 or 11, maybe 12 kc on YAM. And it's got slop bucket detectors in it. It's not right on the panel, slop bucket upper, slop bucket lower, but I never use them, so the switch is dirty and they don't function. Kidding. And yeah, it's a cool radio. It's got a 600 ohm output, which feeds the rest of the balanced audio system here in the room. And it does a nice job. It's even got a scope pickoff. You know, you mentioned that earlier. It's got an IF jack on the back. I don't know what they would use that for on board a commercial ship, unless it was for teletype demodulation or something, maybe something, a WeFax or whatever. But yeah, one of these days I'll have to put the scope on that. I use the scope on transmit, although it's a dual trace scope and I could get it to do both. I just never even thought of doing that, Guy.
Well, since you got rid of some of the boat anchors like the T368 and so forth, you have room for another scope. And by the way, these days you can buy these scopes that have LCD displays on them, and they're pretty small. Or you can go the route that I did and get yourself one of the QIX modulation monitors and run it off of your laptop or desktop or what have you. And that, by the way, I don't know if I don't think you have one of these, but I love that modulation monitor. It has those cool meters on it, the simulated meters that look real, and it has the scope pattern, and it has the LED bar graph. It's just a very cool device to watch your modulation. But I can't do the receive thing with this Anan because there's no IF, so there's no IF output. So that's one thing I miss about this. You know, on my older receivers, some of the receivers I had an IF output, and I could run it to a scope, and I could watch the modulation envelope. But I can't do that on this. The closest I came to that was I had my very first, and they didn't call it SDR at that time. They call it what was it? I guess a PC receiver they called it. I still have it. It was made by Tentec. RX20, is it? I don't know if that's right. Maybe the RX, maybe that's the wrong model number. But it was an inexpensive. I think it was about, well, inexpensive at the time for something new. It was like maybe $200 or so, and it was a PC receiver. But it's a super het. So it had an IF output on the thing, and I could run the output of that to a scope. But that receiver, the audio quality coming out of that thing was not nearly as good as what I have coming out of this Anan or some of the other more up-to-date SDR receivers. But they didn't call it an SDR, but I don't know really what the difference is. I mean, it operated off of my PC, and it was kind of cool, you know. It worked very nicely, but the sound quality coming out of it it wasn't terrible. But when you make the A/B comparison, you can hear it, or if you listen to it compared to a regular receiver, you could hear that it didn't have the clean sound that you get out of a a vacuum tube receiver, or even a good solid state receiver, of conventional design, or even like the like the Anan. The Anan, as far as I'm concerned, has the perfect detector. Because I've done some tests, by the way, with my signal generator against a receiver with a diode detector, and I heard some stories about how modulation percentage up to 100, or as you approach 100%, the distortion rises dramatically, and that's absolutely true. I proved it with my bench generator, which has very clean modulation right up to 100%. Of course, after 100%, it's not clean because it clips, but I mean the bottom clips, not the positive part, but you know what I'm saying. The SDR, I compared it to the Anan. The Anan is clean right up to 100% on receive, but the vacuum tube receiver, and I didn't test all vacuum tube receivers. I tested it on one, a Lafayette HE30, and I have to do this on other receivers too, because it probably holds true, because I mean, I've heard that diode detectors, half-wave diode detectors, do have a certain amount of distortion if the modulation percentage is high, and it may not sound unpleasant to the ear, but it's there. So anyway, I proved that with that half-wave diode detector in that Lafayette HE30, which is not a highly expensive receiver. It was an inexpensive super het receiver, but yet I think it's representative of many receivers of the era, where it looks clean up to a 50-60%. And you're looking at the sine wave. You can measure this too, but just looking at the sine wave, you can see after about 60% or so, it's starting to look like maybe it's not as clean a sine wave as it should be, and then you bring it up to 100%, and then it's obvious to the eye, as you go higher up towards 100%, it's obvious to the eye that the sine wave is no longer a clean sine wave. So I proved that that's true. Anyway, what I'm getting at is that the SDR receivers, since they are not diode detectors, they're using another method of detection which I am unfamiliar with by this black box, but it's all done with software, doesn't have that characteristic. It's clean right up to 100%. So the cleanest sound that I have to my ears is the sound coming out of this Anan receiver. It's really, really super clean. So the fact that modulation percentages distort on receivers, it doesn't apply to the SDR, it's to the Anan anyway. So we're approaching the 10-minute interval, so I better IP now, because by the time it comes back to me, it'll be over the limit. WA3BJB, WB2CAU.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I always wondered why the SDR didn't sound, and that's because they derive it in a different way. Well, to the computer-based rig that you had, the RX20, the Tentec, I think that was the extent of it. I had, and still have, the late Rangers ICOM K3ZRF bought is it an IC? No, I think it's a PCR 1000 computer-controlled black box. It's got RF and power, and an RS 232 on it. And I used that in one of the early internet-based receiver systems known as globaltuners.com. I had a node called the Chesapeake Bay node, and anybody could control it through the Global Tuners website as a remote receiver. And it wasn't SDR. It was a conventional receiver, but its command and control functions were available through that RS-232 port. That may have been what the Ten-Tech version was. Because I don't really understand it now, but when my knowledge was even more primitive, I considered it an SDR as SDR started to come in. I think the WebSDR system was the first platform that I encountered, and I liked that. That was very cool. And then the KiwiSDR system succeeded it. It's a much better system. It continues to be refined and developed, and it has synchronous detection that the WebSDR did not. I'm trying to remember whether the PCF 1000 has sync detection or not. I think it does, but I don't remember because it's been a long time since I powered it up. The laptop that it needed to talk through, the hard drive finally failed after a few years of continuous duty on this node, and I just never, allocated another laptop around here to running it, so it's put away, and you can have it if you want and deal with it from there. I'm running a broadcast modulation monitor from General Radio, and I know you know their test gear, WA3VJB. It's called the 1931A, and it was intended to be with a pickup coil at an AM broadcast station. High-level input, fairly, coupled, not just a BNC off a random loop wire or something. It's got to be in the tank somewhere. And it has a dual input to it. One takes you through, I think, 4 megs, so it's good through 75 meters. And the other tap on the input transformer is from 4 megs to 8 megs, which means it's good through 40 meters. And I've had the thing on, and it sounds great. I don't know what kind of diode detection they've got in there, but it addresses the problem that you mentioned of how asymmetrical modulation past a certain point starts to sound kind of gnarly, or even not asymmetrical. I know this one ran out of steam when it would hear past about 140% positive. It started sounding kind of gnarly, as does the diode detector output of the R390 or the R390A. They just can't deal with the lack of carrier. And so I think Don Chester calls it carrier starvation. That's what the sound gave him the impression of, carrier starvation. So when somebody's running 140% or 150% positive, that's not a good thing. And the same kind of loudness, if that's the goal, can be achieved through compression techniques like I'm running with the Optimot. That's a far more effective way to go because a greater number of receivers can pick it up without fatiguing type of distortions on it. So between the 1931A and running symmetrical modulation, because what we do here apparently sounds better with symmetrical modulation, according to Bob Orban himself, I just decline to run asymmetrical modulation. My loudness comes from compression techniques. And asymmetry, for example, starts sounding gnarly on certain old-style receivers, many of which we encounter here. So, I'm considering the audience, Eric, and I'll run symmetrical modulation with processing to achieve loudness than I will before asymmetrical modulation, which this rig is capable of doing. And I'm just not interested. We were talking earlier about the use of remote receivers as far as antenna comparisons is concerned. My notes here, a little fragment just jumped out at me. The other night, we were testing nighttime conditions, Timmy and I, on his double-wide antenna versus his wire array. And I dialed up a node that was on the southern coast of England to help measure which of his antennas had the real long path advantage. And it wound up being the wire array, where here, much more near field, the double-wide was doing better here at home. So as far as antennas analysis is concerned, I know you said that it really matters most where you're at home, but in that instance, for example, it shed some light on his antenna pattern, at least to the southern coast of England. And I just find it fascinating to be able to use those nodes, not only as a workaround for interference issues, but also to kind of see if you can toss a signal into the area where you might want to make a contact. I was able to put in a fairly good signal on, I guess, 7287, which is above where they can operate. I think they're limited to 7200 for voice. Much of their activity is down on 7160, which is beyond the bandwidth of my antenna. Can't do it. So we're talking about trying to work split, where they'll be on 7160 and I'll be up here somewhere and be able to work across the pond on 40 meters at night, if any of them can stay up that long. By 2 a.m., which is when we were doing these tests, 2 a.m. UK time, everybody over there was in bed and I couldn't work anybody, but at least I knew, thanks to the internet constellation of receivers, that I was putting a signal in there. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good feature of the WebSDR. Is the key. I like the Kiwis, by the way. The conventional. I use the term WebSDR as a generic term, but it also would include the Kiwis. The Kiwis, I think, are the best sounding. They have the most pleasant sounding AGC. The others, I don't like the AGC characteristics on them. It sounds like you're listening to a sideband station on a good receiver, of course, because as soon as someone pauses for a moment, the background noise comes up as if you were on single sideband, with a relatively fast AGC. So I like the AGC characteristics on the Kiwis for AM. And I don't like those other characteristics. But anyway, so you didn't say whether it was a standard WebSDR or whether it was a Kiwi, but that's a good point. I have no idea where my signal ends up. Probably not that far, because my antenna is not up that high. It's really a local antenna. When I say local, I mean it covers the eastern coast of the United States and perhaps a little bit of Canada and so forth. But I doubt very much if my signal can go into the Midwest or the West Coast or into Europe and so forth. But it would be interesting to see if it does. And having a WebSDR at your fingertips enables you to see without having a station at the other end to give you a report. You get your own report. One thing I can't do, though, Paul, is I can't listen to I can listen to myself on the local receiver, of course, because there's no latency, but I cannot listen to myself or have anything going where I'm listening to something that comes a half a second later. I can't speak when I hear my own voice coming back at the wrong time. I know some people practice that and they can do it, but I can't. So I haven't been able to do that. So I have to switch the local receiver back in when I go to transmit. I'm not really listening to myself, by the way, anyway. I used to be able to do that when I had a standard analog receiver, like the SP600 or the R390A. I still have SP600. I have an R390A in the same room here with my DX100, but they haven't been turned on in literally decades. Then I used to monitor myself because it was in real time, but I can't do that with the Anan because there was a little bit of latency, and in the case of this radio here, this Anan, the latency might be only I don't know, maybe 100 milliseconds, but it's enough to confuse me, so I cannot listen on headphones. What else was I going to say here? I wrote down some notes, but actually I wrote down some notes that I can't comment on because I'm not familiar with that receiver, that ITT McKay 3040A solid-state receiver. I have some analog solid-state receivers that I like. I like the R2000. But my very first good solid-state receiver was the R1000. I absolutely loved that. I bought that in the early 1980s. I bought it used, and I think it was a current model when I bought it. I bought it from a guy at work who was moving, and he had only had it for less than a year. And he wanted to get rid of it, and then we were talking back and forth about the price, and finally we negotiated a price which was favorable to both of us. I bought it. It was mint condition, and I absolutely loved it. I thought the R1000 was a really nice receiver. I never used it as a station receiver, though, but I used it as a bedside receiver, and I did an awful lot of listening to what was going on 75 meters on that R1000. And later I updated to an R2000, which I think is also very good. Now the low-end response, audio response on the R2000, and I never really measured the R1000, but I assume the 1000 is probably about the same. The low-end response rolls off a little bit, but most stations don't have a whole lot of deep bass, so you don't notice it. One of these days I may get in there and see if I can modify the audio stages to get it to respond to the lower frequencies, but I'm not even sure whether that's absolutely necessary. But I love the R2000. I also bought an R5000, which was the next model after the 2000. It was from the estate of K3ZRF, Dave. So I have his old R5000, but it suffers one of these maladies that is common to that receiver, as well as the TS440, which I think the TS440 and the R5000 came out of the same generation. And as Dave W2VW indicated to me, there's a problem with the some material that they put in there that absorbs moisture, and it changes things, and you have to get that stuff out of there. And I never did that, so my R5000 was never really usable. But if I get in there and scrape away that stuff that they put in there, I'll be able to use that if I want to. But I buy this stuff with the intent of using it, and it turns out that what I have going here already suits my needs, and how can you beat this Anan? I mean, it's it's just one of these things that you can buy something else to play around with, but you end up going back to what has the features that you like and the sound quality you like, and that's where I'm at. Coming up on 10 minutes to 11, so WA3VJB, WB2CAU.
Yeah, I had a pretty good zero on you, so I knocked the ID out there right when the 10 minutes showed up. I've got one of these atomic clocks up on the wall. Actually, I've got two of them up there. One of them is an analog. I guess it's about a 15-inch diameter. It looks like a schoolhouse clock. And it uses the new WWV frequency shift keying method of delivering telemetry that's more reliable than the analog data burst. And it doesn't ever miss its sync time. And the one to its left is a digital readout, jumbo red LED readout that resembles the control room clocks in a television control room. So I like it too. And right there is 51. Let's see, 1, 2, yeah, it's off a half a second. It still uses the old analog method of calibration, and it sometimes doesn't see signal. When we built the radio lodge, I had them put aluminum foil continuous in the drywall, aluminum foil insulation, to help make a Faraday cage, not only from stuff coming in, but also stuff going out. And I think it has trouble hearing the WWV long wave signal as a result. But it looks cool alongside the other one, and does its job pretty well. Yeah, the R1000, I've got one here that I got on trade when I worked at WLMD, a little AM daytimer, when I first got out of college. I guess it was 1980, 81 or so is when I got it. They ran commercials for their computer end, not the ham radio end, but for the computer end. They ran commercials on my radio station, and I got this R1000 for free. They live on barter. The littlest stations live on barter. We traded gasoline for news cruises. We traded spots for the studio equipment, lighting, and chairs. Trade everything. That was the GM's mantra. So this R1000, I actually did use with the 32V2, and I didn't like its stepped attenuator. It actually it burned out after a while, or it physically deteriorated and started getting dead spots in it between 0 and 10 dB, or whatever the first step is. Sometimes it was a lot happier if I put the first attenuation step in there, and going back and forth, that switch couldn't take it. So it's got dead spots in it, and the light bulbs burn out, and the fluorescent LEDs have gone out. Some of the segments have gone out. Poor thing. But boy, that was a nice sounding radio. You're absolutely right. The record output jack fed a line amplifier that I then would use to make recordings, and its passband was a lot more generous than anything else that I had at the time. I think the wide mode on the R1000 was probably 15, and narrow was 6. So yeah, you could really get some good audio out of that thing. I even bought the WB2CAU, which was the, if you remember, a little cover on the back. It was an optional DC input accessory, and I used to use it camping as well with the DC input. And I still have the cable and the WB2CAU accessory jack mounted in there. It's the only time I've ever been in it. Actually, I might have been in it to clean that switch, that RF attenuator, so I wish they'd have given me a knob. But the poor thing's kind of sad. I've kept it out of nostalgic sake more than anything. And I remember when the R2000 came out, that was, supposed to be a pretty hot receiver. Then the R5000, and I saw that at Wanger's place when both Pam and Dave VW were trying to square away and inventory all his stuff. I went up there to help take pictures and post stuff to a website where a lot of that stuff distributed out. Wait a minute. Did we get together up there at some point or other? Did I see you then? Because your email a while ago referred to the tribute lunch that we might have met up at the pub where Dave and Pam used to hang out. But I also may remember you actually coming to the house where he had all that stuff in the shop out back. And Dave had told me about the sticky switch syndrome on that R5000, which was a shame because it otherwise was a good radio and it still has a lot of potential to be fixed. But I got to tell you, before I forget, the Anan 100 has really proven to be a winner among older SDR transceivers. I've worked a few of them now, and they all sound good when they're set up properly, and they're underappreciated in the marketplace. I think a lot of people are seduced by the latest and greatest stuff, but the Anan 100, which you have, has really acquitted itself as a good-sounding transceiver on both transmit and receive. It reminds me very much of the Flex 1000 that came out about, 20 years ago now. Had all kinds of umbilical cables and individual module. Had the first one that I ever worked. And it's like, this is the way to go. Look at this. And it's been good ever since. And I think the Anan 100, although I was left...
Oh, of course, it's a little backward now. You're right. It came out about 20 years ago. I think it was around 2002, 2003, something like that. I bought mine at the tail end of its existence, right at the time when it was discontinued. By the time when I ordered it and when I received it, I think it had already been discontinued. So I probably have one of the last production runs of the SDR 1000, and I bought it at the same time as a friend of mine, WB2CAU, and he's already sold his, so he doesn't even have it anymore. But he has the Anan 7000 now, and I don't think there's a whole lot of difference in the sound quality between the two. I think the 7000 is every bit as good as the 100. It has a few more features that the 100 doesn't have, so it's not a bad. The 7000 is pretty good. I wish I had one, but I can't go out and buy every brand new model that comes out. It's it's not possible for me, especially at the price point that these things sell for. No, I never was down your way, Paul. The only time I was down your way was for Gaithersburg 1 year in 1993, and I don't recall if I saw you at Gaithersburg that year or not. I did meet Dave, the K3ZRF, that time. I think that was the one and only time I ever met Dave, and he was with what's his call now? Gary, N2INR. So I met him there. But I've met Gary a few times, Deerfield and so forth. And I met you at Deerfield too, but I think the first time that we met, well, maybe the first time we met was at Deerfield, but I know I met you at Nick's house. Nick, KG2IR, lives 4 miles away from me here, and I went over there when you were visiting him, and I ended up bringing you to the train station. I don't know if you remember that, but I drove you to the train station because you had, I think, taken the train from New York City out to Huntington, to the Huntington train station, and you needed a ride back, so I brought you to the train station. So I met you that time, and I know I met you a couple of times at Deerfield, but that's it. I've never been to your house, never been to the the K3ZR off a state sale or anything like that, so you might be mixing me up with someone else. Now, as far as the 3 filters in the R1000, actually you can only access 2 at a time. There's a jumper inside where you can move it around, so you can have you can select the which 2 that you use. There's a very narrow, which I think is like 2.7 kilohertz wide, and then the next one I think is it 6? And you can select those 2, or you can select the 2 like 6 or 12. I think 12 is the widest position, but 12 is a little too wide under busy band conditions. But these days, if you don't have a busy band, 12 is fine. I think it's 12. I could be off with that, but you can only use the narrow or the wide, but there's a jumper inside, so you can select either which one is narrow and which one is wide. And as far as the attenuator switch, yeah, I agree with you about that problem. The problem exists with the R2000 also, and you have to get in there with deoxit and clean it and blow it out with compressed air, and it'll hold up for a while, but then you'll have to redo it again. So that seems to be a problem. What else was I going to say? I guess that's about it of the comments, and I know you want to get going. I probably should get going here too. I can start my project here where I have to move stuff out of this filing cabinet, and rather stay in the house where it's air conditioned than go outside where it's getting hotter. It's 85 degrees here with 64% humidity according to my outdoor sensor. So Paul, it's been a pleasure. We've had a very good one-on-one here. I like one-on-one conversations best of all. If you've ever gone to read my long bio on QRZ, you'll see that I describe all these things and my mode of operating, and that I'm not a contester, I'm not a certificate hunter or anything like that. I like one-on-one conversations the best. So this really was a very enjoyable QSO. Anyway, I'll say 7-3. Good talking with you, Paul. Good sounding signal, of course, as always. Good sounding station. And except for a period of time there when my signal was dropping down to you and you dropping down to me, your signal is back up again, and you're wall-to-wall. WA3VJB, this is WB2CAU, 7-3.
Okay, Art. Yeah, you're headed down the roller coaster right now, as a matter of fact, so it's probably a good time to sign. Yeah, well, I wondered why the Flex 1000 didn't continue in production. I met up with one of the principals of Flex Radio. I think they're out of Texas. At a Dayton Hamvention, they had a booth there, and I took the time to praise their contribution to our part of the hobby by creating a rig that sounded good on AM, on transmit and receive, and so on. And I said, I wonder if you would consider repositioning the Flex 1000, because it had already gone out of production by then. I wonder if you could consider repositioning that as an AM transceiver, a marketing function. And he wasn't that keen on it. I think they probably had some production limitations on the way that rig was set up. So they had to discontinue it flat out. They couldn't remarket it. I said, you're already capitalized with whatever production logistics you've got. So just rebadge the thing as some kind of AM transceiver and let people get on with that. And nothing ever came of it. But I saw that kind of potential for it even back then. And I think the Anan 100 was another example where it was underappreciated by those of us here, and in retrospect wound up being discovered by those of us here as just a high fine business kind of a transceiver. So yeah, I don't get seduced by all the extra features that an Anan 7000 might have if the basic 100 does the kind of job that I'm hearing out of yours. So yeah, very good. I don't think I've ever actually done the jumper thing on the R1000. I'd completely forgot about that. I wanted the 6 and the 12, and it's been good. And I think up on 10 meters, the 12 was quite handy. You had enough elbow room up there. Even 35, 40 years ago, you had enough elbow room up there to enjoy that kind of band spread. And I paired it with the homebrew transmitter up there to go with it. Oh, and on QRZ.com, if you look at the pictures of my station, you'll see the 3040 Alpha right below the Super Senior. I like it because it's got the same black panel motif as does the Super Senior. It's almost as if they were made for each other. And so I keep them next to each other in that rack that's on the far side of the room. Anyway, catch you later. Good luck with your project there on the file cabinet. I like the idea of putting a dolly underneath it so you can get around it again. Although, as you point out, some of the stuff you've got plugged into those outlets has sit there quietly for 30 years. So why bother? You know, once you get it fixed and you get the outlet replaced, it's done for another 30 years, you know? As long as you live. There's that line, right? See you later. And yeah, I've enjoyed it very much. WB2CAU, WA3. Oh, and I do remember the train trip, by the way. Quick story there. When I got to Penn Station, there was a track fire. And I called WCBS because I was there and you know, could report on it. And I lined up an attractive woman who was also coming out of the same set of steps that I came out of. I said, hey, I'm about to go live on WCBS. Let me put you on as a witness. And she was, you know, friendly. Yeah, sure. So I think it was Harley Carnes. Said, oh, we have us on the phone now. You know, Paul Corson, he's at Penn Station where there's a track fire. Paul, what can you tell us? And I spooled out what I understood of it at the time. And I said, this passenger here told us that it was just part of being a New Yorker to come up out of the hole like that. And she went on and she said, yeah, this is what you do when you're in New York. Something happens like this and you come out of the hole and you're done. And I said, so Harley, back to you. And there I was. Nick had recorded that. He happened to be listening, and he recorded that live shot and sent it to me on a DAT tape many years later. It's like, full circle. Anyway, you're reminding me of my ride to the train station, and thank you again for that. WB2CAU, WA3, VJB, clear.
Yeah, if you don't mind, could you send me that clip, or you still have it available?
Oh, I bet I could find it. I bet you Nick could find it easier than I can, but yeah, it's in the VJB archives for sure.
All right. Okay, thank you in advance. Have a good day and stay cool. WA3VJB, WB2CAU.
See you later, Eric. Been fun.